Hello, folks. Welcome back to another compilation of strange and spooky winter wilderness stories submitted by our listeners. As we begin to transition from winter to spring, many of us will find ourselves itching to get outdoors again. But before you do, you may want to take these experiences into consideration before doing so. So here you go. Last winter, I was making my way across Highway 108 inside the Stanislaus National Forest in California. I decided to pull over to stretch my legs and enjoy some sweet views of the surrounding geography. I pulled into the nearby Donald Vista Point, and even though it was middle of February, it was crystal clear and quite pleasant outside that day. From the main parking area, I walked down a short path to the observation point, where a couple of folks had gathered to enjoy the views. What was interesting was that there were no other cars in that parking lot other than mine. But I shrugged it off and just enjoyed the views as well. To the west, I can see the remnants of a recent fire that had scorched some distant woodland. Below was Middle Fork River Canyon and Donald Reservoir, and off in the backdrop was the Dardanelles. It was around 11 a.m. and the sun was nearly overhead. The older couple was about 30 feet to my right, back turned as they faced the opposite direction. But they weren't really talking or moving, just standing there motionless and staring off into the wilderness. It was like this for about 15 to 20 minutes. I noticed that the sun had dimmed, casting a large shadow over the region, and when I looked up I saw a small but thick cloud covering the sun. This also struck me as odd, as this was the only cloud in sight, and it chose to sit there hovering directly over the sun. At that moment I lowered my gaze back to the couple, and they were now gone, completely absent from the very ledge they had stood on just seconds ago. Fearing the worst, I sprinted over to that ledge and looked over it, but nothing but granite and shrub for hundreds of feet below. It didn't appear the two jumped or fell. I was perplexed. I still remember the pink polo she had on and the black and white flannel that he had been wearing. Easy to spot, you would think. That older couple, it seems, had vanished into thin air. I did a short search of that area, following the outer reaches of the observation areas, and even walked the path back to my car twice. I didn't see or hear any other vehicles, and I would eventually report my observations to the Sonora Police Department, and that was that. A later online search of the area revealed a relatively eerie find. Several people went missing in that area in recent times, but I couldn't find anything about a missing couple. That's all I've got. Thank you. Story 2. In February of 2009, I had a pretty wild experience during a short day hike inside the Red River Gorge Park in Kentucky, a place I had been to on a few different occasions. I always went solo, but this time I decided to bring along my 5-year-old son. I wanted to get him familiar to the area as we were considering moving to a nearby town in the coming months. It was a cold and overcast afternoon, around 2 p.m. when Gray and I entered the Whittleton Arch Trail, which is an easy 2.5-mile trek that offers stunning geological views and perfect for a youngin' with the energy level of an atomic bomb. I would let him wander a bit ahead of me on the trail, maybe about 20 feet or so. He'd stop, pick up random objects on the ground, and toss them back into the nearby forest. Well, once we passed the iconic Whittleton Arch, I saw something strange. As usual, my son was jumping and skipping ahead of me on the trail, when I noticed a dark shadow, about the size of a grown man, jet up to gray, and then leap back into the woods again. Immediately, I shouted for him to stop, before running up and grabbing the boy's hand. I turned my attention to the surrounding woods, spent about a minute trying to confirm what I had just seen. Nothing. It happened so quickly, I could barely remember the details. Just a shadow of a man that seemed a bit opaque and quicker than hell. I remember asking myself, did I imagine the whole thing? I know what I saw, so I turned around and we began walking back toward the parking area. My son kept asking why we were heading back, but I told him not to worry and that he wasn't in any trouble. I continued watching our surroundings. A few minutes later, I let go of his hand as I knew we were getting close to the trailhead. And then it happened again. Gray was only about 10 feet ahead of me this time, when a shadowy figure shot out of the woodline and lashed itself onto my son. But he didn't even notice. I found myself running up to Gray while yelling obscenities at this thing. It seemed to notice my presence because it sprinted back into the woodline when it saw me approaching. This time I picked up my son and ran the rest of the way back. I would eventually tell him that there was a wild cat in the area just to soothe his curiosities. But I knew better. This figure gave me quite a fright, and whatever it was doing or trying to do with my son wasn't good. It was interested in him only, much like that of a mountain lion stalking the weakest of the herd. At least that's the feeling I got from it. It wasn't standing upright either, but more like a shadow of something that was. It was just the shadow, and that's it. I'm still scratching my head over this experience. If anyone else out there had a similar sighting, I'd like to know. Thank you. Story 3. A couple of years ago, I had what some might call an extraordinary experience out in the redwoods of Mendocino County, California. It was a cold January day, and I decided to partake in one of my favorite hobbies, tree climbing. I've been doing it since college, and not only was it a great way to get in shape, but the reward was often worth it, offering stunning views and unique perspectives. So I stopped in over at Richardson's Grove State Park, an exceptional grove of lowland redwoods that hugs the Eel River, which is located just off Highway 101. I realize my hobby isn't exactly recommended by park officials, but I do it anyway, and I've never been caught. I suppose that's half the thrill for me, but hey, I could be doing worse things out there in those parks. Once I parked my car, I hacked into a section of the park not easily accessible or seen by many visitors, that overlooks a stunning section of the Eel River. It's a bit of a challenge to get back in there, but at least I was confident that I could climb in peace. I usually choose smaller or younger growth because, let's face it, it's both an easier and far less dangerous climb. It wasn't long before I spotted my tree, a young and healthy 75-foot tall marvel. For the first 15 feet or so, I inched my way up the branchless trunk until I reached the first set of branches. Before I continued on, I stopped to rest and take a look around the surrounding forest. It was calm and quiet, Lush green canopies hung over the red carpets of earth below. It was gorgeous. Next, I adjusted my equipment, and the real climbing began. I crawled my way upward through the jungle gym of knobs and branches, occasionally picking off insects and debris. Then I heard a strange sound emanating from the forest around me. It was a loud burst of what sounded like laughter. Short but quite noticeable, even through the scratching and climbing sounds I was making. It was enough to get me to stop and examine the nearby trees, as it almost seemed to be coming from the ones right next to mine. I was about 50 feet up now, with about another 25 feet to go. Maybe it was a bird I was hearing, so I shrugged it off and continued on up. About 15 minutes later, I'm pretty much at my final destination. Any further up, and the branches would be too fragile to hold my weight. But there I was, overlooking that beautiful Yellow River, as the sun decided to punch a hole through the afternoon fog, just long enough to paint the surrounding landscape in vibrant shades of pine and mahogany. Not long after, the fog returned, and there went the sun. I took another several minutes to enjoy the views, snack on a power bar, and swim in my achievements. I decided it was time to head back down. As I began to lower myself, my attention was drawn to the tops of those nearby trees, at around the same level as the one I was in. These were about 20 to 30 feet away from me, but then I noticed something move at the top of one of those trees. It took me a moment to realize that it was another man. I got a cold shiver when I realized this man was watching me. Upon closer inspection, the guy was the spitting image of me. A thin build, reddish beard, and short but shaggy hair. He even wore the same style and color of clothes I was wearing. What were the chances of that? I told myself in utter amazement. But as I sat there, perched up in that tree, the man continued to stare. When I shifted, he seemed to shift too. And when I waved to the guy, he did the same, at the exact same time. It was like looking at a mirror image of myself sitting in that neighboring tree. But then it was dawning on me that the guy was mimicking my every move. And suddenly, my curiosities turned into fear when he stopped moving, even though I kept going. He was stuck frozen in place, and his eyes grew large before bellowing out the most sinister of laughter I have ever heard, followed by these animalistic grunting noises. It was then my adrenaline kicked in and I began to descend as quickly as I could, as I was nearly free climbing at this point, but something told me I had to get out of there fast. Everything about this guy was wrong. I was so dead set on my descent that I never even stopped to listen if he was doing the same. It wasn't long before I leapt onto the forest floor. Nearly out of steam now, I ran as quickly as I could back to the car, but not before I noticed a shower of debris raining down, and then my observations seemed to confirm my fears. The man was in my tree, and he was making his way down quickly. I don't know how he did it, but somehow he managed to jump from his neighboring tree to mine, and now he was definitely following me. At that point, I abandoned my bag full of gear and sprinted back to the car. 5 minutes later, I'm in my car and back on the road, completely numb from my frightening experience. It took a long time to process this. I had heard many strange stories people have had while out in the wilderness, but after a certain point, it almost becomes just that, stories. But never did I imagine I'd find myself sharing my own bizarre encounter. Does anyone out there know or have an idea of what I saw? Thank you, Andy. Story 4. I own a small dog-sitting business out in Colorado, and on this particular weekend, I was sitting one of my regulars, Bark, a quiet 2-year-old lab-mixed mutt who was always quite a pleasure to have along for adventures. It was a cold winter's day when I decided to bring Bark out on a short day's hike near the Rockies at a place called Kruger Rock Trail, a 1,300-acre dog-friendly campground and RV area with a variety of smaller trails that offers rewarding views of Mount Meeker, the Continental Divide, and Mummy Range. I decided to take the two of us up the 2-mile trail and back on a cold but sunny afternoon. There was a fresh layer of snow on the ground from the day before, but it wasn't that deep at all, maybe about an inch or less. Well, after enjoying Kruger's views, we set back toward the trailhead, but on the way back something really odd happened out there. About halfway back, Bark stopped on the trail, kind of between two boulders, and refused to go any further, even when I escorted him to move on by jerking his leash. He just stood there, stared, ears in reverse. I then noticed some movement coming from a tree limb hanging over the trail about 15 feet up and about 20 feet ahead of us. The branch just sprang up and down slowly, like something was perched up on top of it. I just assumed a large bird had been there seconds before flying off. But that didn't explain why Bark was so hesitant to leave that spot. Eventually I got him to follow, even though he would go, stop, and then repeat the process. There was maybe only 5 people on the trail during that time we were there, so it was pretty quiet overall. But I remember getting this uneasy feeling as we continued walking back. We were about 10 minutes away when I remember pulling on Bark's leash to catch up with me, as he continued to resist. And then it happened. As I went to tug on his leash once again, I felt nothing on the other end, a complete weightlessness that I was not prepared for. And then I spun around to see that Bark had completely vanished. His collar was still perfectly attached to the leash, but that was it. I immediately called out for several minutes straight, thinking maybe the guy had leapt into the nearby woods or backtracked to chase some critter. But the only set of paw prints I saw in that snow were the ones going forward on the trail, intertwined with mine. I was perplexed. No other prints, no sounds, no barking, no warning. Bark was just gone. I remained on that trail for another hour or so before the sun made its evening descent, and it grew quite cold and windy, and I had to stop looking as darkness was right around the corner, and I didn't have a flashlight. As you might imagine, I was a bit frantic. I eventually made my way back to the trailhead, spent another hour calling out for Bark before finally leaving, but not before stopping at the visitor center on my way out of the park. But standing there inside the main info center was Bark. I explained to the park employee what had happened, and he too was as stumped as I was, especially given that Bark was found 12 miles away in the opposite direction, wandering through someone else's campsite. Lucky for me, the family at that campsite returned him to the visitor center, not knowing what to do with them. But I'm quite shocked how this could have happened in a short amount of time. But I guess I'm one of the lucky ones, ain't I? I'm just happy I didn't have to make that phone call to his owners. Reese. Story 5. Back in the winter of 2018, when I was in college, me and the oldest took off to a lake in the wilds of Glacier County. I have extensive backcountry exposure, even did a stint as a big game guide in a remote backcountry camp. But on this day, we did a little camping, hiking, and fishing, and then settled in for the night. I pulled out my pan and stoked up a nice fire. It was clear and cool as the sun faded into the western slopes. We cooked up some fresh rainbow trout with garlic and butter and filled our stomachs. I leaned back against the cooler after putting out a refreshing beverage. The boy was soon asleep by the fire, as it had been a busy day. I sipped my beer and watched the moonlight bouncing off the little waves in the lake. There was still a glow on the western horizon where the sun had gone down, and I could see the outline of the mountain peaks towering over the little lake. I slowly faded off to sleep with the sound of the lake waves gently lapping on the rocks. But not long after, I awoke abruptly. The fire was out, the lantern was too, the moon was gone, and it was pitch black. But I knew something was wrong. The hair on the back of my neck stood out straight, and I was paralyzed. I could hear my heart thumping as I strained to hear something in the bushes, but it was so quiet. A horrible, uneasy feeling fell upon me, and I gathered myself together and started kicking around the fire. A small flame came alive, and I quickly threw on some kindling. In that small fire, I could see that my boy had awoken, and was shocked to see his wide-open eyes staring at me, asking, "What's wrong?" "Nothing. Go climb in the tent," I told him, and I reassured him that everything was fine. He made his way into the tent, but even in the light of the fire, I couldn't shake my weariness. Something was out there in those bushes. It's a feeling I'd never had before, and given all the days and nights I spent out in the wilderness, this seemed quite different and shocking to me. I gathered up my light and flashed around camp. Nothing. Finally, I began to calm down and crawled into the tent with my son. Then again, like clockwork, I awoke completely tense. This time I couldn't shake the feeling I was getting. I finally instructed the boy to wake up and to get into the truck. I quickly packed up all of our camping gear and drove to the other side of the lake, where we would sleep in the truck until the wee hours of the morning. At the first light, I got up and looked across the lake where we had been camping earlier, and another uneasy feeling came over me. I decided it was time to go home. I don't know what was out there, but I know my gut instincts, and something was wrong with that place. Whatever it was, I will leave it to your imagination, but it creeps me out to this day to think about it, and I believe that my gut instinct may have saved our lives. I just can't explain it. Thank you for sharing my story, Forrest. And there you have it. I'll be working on some new projects in the coming months, so you can expect to see that before too long. Keep your senses sharp. Get out there. Be safe, and you'll hear from me soon.